And then as we looked at chapter 7, we learned he announced that judgment was near. He says the end has come in verse 2. Throughout the land there will be an end that will come because of God's anger against them and because the judgment must come. The end, of course, referring to the end of the destruction, referring to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the people as a nation. And so he had to do that because God is a God of absolute holiness, absolute justice, and therefore sin cannot be unaccounted for. Sin must be punished. And he announces very clearly that there's going to be a judgment that would come. Down in chapter 7 and verse 5, we talked about as he says, a singular disaster. Among all the others, there seems to be a special one. My view is that's the destruction of the temple. He doesn't actually say that, but I think we can probably come to that conclusion because that was the greatest thing in the life of the Jew. And so judgment is about to come, and it will come in about 6 or 7 years, maybe a little bit sooner than that, at the third invasion of the land by the Babylonians when Jerusalem will be destroyed. And they're a very ungrateful nation. God had made them a special people. He had given them the privilege of bringing the Messiah into the world, and yet they turned away from God. They took God's blessings and never seemed to really appreciate those blessings. They had much more than got out of Egypt till they began to complain. They were a complaining nation all the way through. And they took the great blessings of God and misused those blessings. I think we can see the epitome of that. If you look in chapter 7 that we talked about last week, and notice again verse 20. He talked about the beauty of God's ornaments that he set in majesty. And what did they do with them? They took the blessings of God and made from them their images of their abominations. Hosea talked about the same thing. And so we're looking at a group of people here. It's amazing how they have turned, how far they have strayed away from God. And so we talked about chapter 6 and 7 last week. Let's look at chapters 8 and 9 tonight. And if you look at the time frame and compare it with the opening verse or two of the book, you're going to see that there's a little over a year has gone by from the beginning of the book. And so it says, it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, that I sat in my house. So evidently Ezekiel had a place to live while he was down in Babylon. And with him were the elders of Judah. So it seems that some of those had been carried down there as well. And the hand of the Lord fell upon me. That's a term that simply means that God is about to show him something else. He's about to reveal something else to the prophet. And as he looked, verse 2, and you'll find a very close comparison to this with chapter 1 and verse 27. As he began that great message there, he begins this one the same way. He sees a likeness to the appearance of fire. From the appearance of his waist downward, fire from his waist and upward, like the appearance of the brightness, like the color of amber. So it's simply a very vivid picture of the character of God. And what did God do? Well, he said he stretched out a form of a hand. Many phrases like this in Ezekiel's prophecy that might sound strange to us. But he stretched forth the form of a hand. And then he took me by the lock of my hair. That's a rather strange thing. He'd have a hard time doing that with some of us, but he didn't seem to have that problem with Ezekiel. Some wondered about that earlier in the chapter, I think it was chapter 5, where he was told to shave his beard and his hair off. And so evidently enough time has gone by that he has some hair, and so he took the prophet by the lock of his hair, he lifted him up, and he brought me in visions to Jerusalem. Now remember where Ezekiel is at this time. He is over in Babylon. And from an east to west direction, he's about 600 miles due east of where his home was in Palestine, and that great desert between those two nations. And so what do you see here, Ezekiel? He said, well, there was a seat of the image of jealousy which provokes to jealousy. We think normally about jealousy being a bad thing, but it can be a good thing in many ways too. And we're going to learn something about that a little bit later on. And so as he was privileged to see this, he called it an altar or an image of jealousy. Now, what was that? Turn with me back to the book of 2 Kings. Let's get the historical record of this. And I think we can probably connect that up with what we see in 2 Kings chapter 21. In 2 Kings 21, the king is Manasseh. And he was a very wicked king. He reigned for 55 years, the longest of all of those kings. It's kind of strange that Manasseh, as wicked and evil as he was the son of one of the most godly kings that Judah had. He was the son of Hezekiah. And then when you look on the other side of Hezekiah, you see Ahaz, and Hezekiah was a godly man. Ahaz was very wicked. And so you have a grandfather and a father and a grandson, and in between, he's the only right one of the bunch. But we're told in chapter 21 of 2 Kings that Manasseh began to reign when he was 12 years old. And notice what he did. He built the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said in Jerusalem, I will put my name there. God said, my name will be there. And yet Hezekiah has these heathen altars over there. And he made his son pass through the fire. He practiced that form of heathenism, human sacrifice. Used witchcraft, consulted spiritists and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord. He even set a carved image of Asherah. Now, Asherah was the female counterpart of Baal, just about as idolatrous as you could get. So he took this image of Asherah, and which he had made in the house which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name there. God says my name. Now, what this king has done has taken that out and put this altar there. It's an altar, and God was jealous of that. God is a jealous God. We'll say some more about that in just a moment here. And of course, a little bit later on, if you read over in 2 Kings chapter 23, you'll have another good king come along by the name of Josiah, and he will take those things and destroy them, even as Hezekiah had done. But in the temple area there, we find this thing that some translations call a seat of jealousy. It moved God to jealousy. And it was idol worship. In the giving of the Ten Commandments, in Exodus chapter 20, God said, you shall have no other gods before me. And he said, I am a jealous God. In Exodus chapter 34, we're even told that his name is jealous. In the second chapter of the book of Nahum, the little prophet, later on, he is a jealous God. Nahum chapter 2 and chapter 1 and verse 2. And so here is what is now facing the people. Now keep in mind that this prophet is not actually in Jerusalem. Look back at the verse again. He brought me in visions. These were things that he was seeing in a vision. And this is how far the people had gone away from God. And so he says, I beheld the glory of God of Israel was there like the vision that I saw in the plain. Now he's going to kind of enumerate these abominations for us in the rest of the chapter. There will be 4 of them as you follow the chapter down. He's going to return to this idea of jealousy again. Notice in verse 5, then he said to me, Son of man, lift up your eyes toward the north. So I lifted up my eyes toward the north, and there north of the altar gate was the image of jealousy in the entrance. Now, I hope we can see why that's called the image of jealousy. It's will be explained a little more fully to us a little bit later on, but let's look back at the book of 2 Kings again, get the historical account of this. 2 Kings chapter 16, King Ahaz, who was the grandfather of this king that has set this idol up, in 2 Kings chapter 16, we find that he is about to be threatened by the Assyrians. I mentioned earlier that sometimes some of these kings, they would try to buy off these heathen kings. And there's coming a time when that wasn't going to work. And that's exactly what Ahaz did here. Look at 2 Kings chapter 16 down in verse 7. Tiglath-Pileser, that's a mouthful, but that's the king of Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser was also called Pul, P-U-L. Maybe that's easier to say. But that was the king of Assyria, and he's threatening Ahaz. And rather, he's threatening the nation. So Ahaz goes to him and tries to get him to help deliver him from the king of Syria. And how did he do that? Well, verse 8, he took the silver and gold and tried to buy that king off. And so the king of Assyria heeded him, for the king of Assyria went up against Damascus. Now that would be, as he said over here in the prophet we're looking at, to the north. That's where all that took place. And so that aroused God to jealousy when he did that. Now you might ask the question, what were they doing in that vein of so-called worship? Well, you can read the rest of 2 Kings 16. You'll see all kinds of idolatrous practices that took place. And so this is what the prophet sees now. Up in Damascus, he sees this image or this altar of jealousy. Furthermore, he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they're doing? If you're still there in 2 Kings 6 and come down to verse 15, and you'll see all of those wicked things that they were doing. All of those idolatrous practices. Let's just look at that for a minute, because I mean that tells you just about how far these people have gone away from God. So the question was, what are they doing? Down in verse 15, 2 Kings 16 verse 15. Then King Ahaz commanded Urijah the priest. Now you remember what he'd done. He'd gone off up to the north early and he'd seen an altar that he liked. He liked it better than one that God had. So he had Urijah the priest make him one like it. And that's why in verse 15 it's called the great new altar. On the great new altar, the morning burnt offering, the evening grain offering, the king's burnt sacrifice, the grain offering, the burnt offering of all the people of the land, the grain offering, the drink offering, all of these things were being practiced on that heathen altar. And that's how far these people had drifted away from God. And so in answer to the question in verse 6, Son of man, do you see what they're doing? Look at that record and you'll see what the people were doing at that time. How serious was that? Well, earlier we saw God said that my name should be written there. But he said what they're doing now, look at about down the middle ways of verse 6, is to make me go away from my sanctuary. Jerusalem had become so wicked, they had become so sinful, that God was going to remove his presence from the city. Still a little bit of Ben's thunder here in the next 2 or 3 chapters. In chapter 11, you're going to see that's exactly what God did. He left the city. And so that's how serious they were. And God would have no part with that. Ultimately, that temple would be destroyed by Nebuzaradan, the military general of Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's the first abomination that he sees. He sees this idol of jealousy. But then he says, turn again, latter part of verse 6. I'll show you a greater abomination. So let's look at the second one. He brought me to the door of the court. And the times that I've tried to teach Ezekiel, I've never tried to focus in on exactly where those little places like that are. I think there's so much speculation on that. I just take it that he took him to the door of the court. It was somewhere in that temple area. He said, I saw a hole in the wall. I told you he saw some strange thing in Ezekiel's prophecy. He sees a hole in the wall. And then he said to me, Son of man, dig into the wall. And when I dug into the wall, there was a door. What's that all about? It seems to me that when he gets through that and sees the door and looks in there, he's going to see some wickedness. They were trying to hide that wickedness, but God knew it was there. And so he tells the prophets, you dig into the wall, and he finds this door. And so he said to me, go in and see the wicked abominations which they're doing there. He wants the prophet to know exactly what's going on. And so when he digs through, there appears a door, and he sees another abomination, in addition to the altar of jealousy back in verses 5 and 6. And so he says, now, here's what I did. I went in and I saw. So the prophet now looks in through that door, and he says, I saw every sort of creeping things, abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed all around on the walls. Can you imagine going into a place where God is supposed to be worshiped? And not only do you find all these images, all these idols, but on the walls are painted portraits of what they're supposed to look like. These were the people of Israel. These were God's people. That's how far they had strayed away from God. And so he said, I see these creeping things, these abominable beasts, everything that would be repugnant to a true worshiper of Jehovah. And here's what these people had. They worshiped nearly everything. The Egyptians were known for that. They even worshiped bugs. They had a god for everything. And so when we read about people like the Egyptians, we don't think too much about that because that's who they were. But keep in mind, this was the nation of Israel. No wonder God let them go. No wonder God allowed them to go into that captivity. He hated to do that. In the 13th chapter of Hosea, he said, I looked upon Israel as a child. I took him by the arms. I taught him how to go. Can you imagine a picture like that of a father taking a little child, learning to walk, and helping him along, picking him up when he falls? That's the picture that prophet gives us. And that's what God did with this nation. And you're going to see some more of that very clearly when you get over to chapter 16. Chapter 16 in many ways is a horrible chapter when it comes to what kind of people these had turned to. And you remember back in Exodus chapter 11, God said, I'm making a distinction between clean things and unclean things. the unclean things you stay away from. Don't you eat them. Don't you have anything to do with them. But here he says, I looked and saw all of these abominable beasts. Well, what else did you see, Ezekiel? Well, he said, and there stood before them. I take that pronoun them to refer to all of their idols. Standing before all of these idols are 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, of all people. The elders of the house of Israel, 70 of them. And in their midst stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan. Each had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. Here were the elders of the people. You jump over into today. In a congregation of God's people, where there are good, godly elders, who would be the last people that you'd think would fall away, if we might use that term? Not that any man is not subject to it, but of all people, these we would not expect that of. And yet here were the 70 of the elders of Israel that were burning incense to a ridiculous idol. I'm not real sure who this Shaphan is. In the 35th chapter of Jeremiah, there was a Shaphan back there that was a good man. Whether or not this is him who has turned bad or not, I don't know. It really doesn't matter. But I think in this we can see the depths to which this nation had sunk. The elders of the people. Keep in mind this is a vision, but it shows us clearly the reality of what was going on. Verse 12, then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the room of his idols. That's, for some reason, that makes me think about digging through this wall back here, trying to hide that. For they said, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. The Lord does not see us. That's the attitude that even these elders had. Their idolatry was practiced in the dark. And sometimes we think that God doesn't see us. Look back 2 prophets to the prophecy of Isaiah for just a moment. And Isaiah touched on this. I believe chapter 29, chapter that I want, Isaiah 29, coming down to about verse 15. There's a woe spoken to certain people. Woe to those who sink deep to hide their counsel far from the Lord, and their works are in the dark, and they say, who sees us and who knows us? They're just kidding themselves. God knows. You can't hide from God. And in fact, if you look over in this book we're looking at, look at Ezekiel, the next chapter, chapter 9 and verse 9. Then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of bloodshed, and the city full of perversity. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. Doing all of these things, thinking that God doesn't know about it. And that's the second abomination. So he says, verse 13, turn again, I want to show you another one. Any questions down to this point, comments? All right. He brought me to the door of the north gate of the Lord's house. And to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz, if that's the right pronunciation of it. Now, who is this Tammuz? He was another god, a so-called god. He was their god of agriculture. And he was equivalent to the Greek god Adonis that they worshiped. And that would be, of course, over in the Western mythology that we read so much about. It had to do with the fertility of the land. It would die out and then it would come back. Well, what does this Tammuz have to do with it? Well, according to their legend, Tammuz had died. Kind of equivalent to their crops dying out. But then Tammuz was resurrected according to their mythology, which was equal to the coming back of the crops in the spring of the year. And so they were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. This god had died, And then he was supposed to have been resurrected. So they're sitting there crying about that. So you think, how ridiculous can a people be? Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, I'll show you a greater abomination. Here's the fourth one. Verse 16. He brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And there at the door of the temple, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east. And they were worshiping the sun toward the east. The people of Israel? Yes. Here they were in the temple. God said, this is where I'm to be worshipped. And notice what they did. They had their back to the temple, facing the east, worshiping the sun. And God had said a long time ago, back in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 19, he said, you don't need to be about this business of worshiping the sun and the moon and all these heavenly bodies. And we got people today in the world still doing that. As I tell people, you go see one of them, he'll tell you about your horoscope. Did I say that right? But anyway, that's what it amounts to. But this is another thing that he said. Now he says, have you seen this, O son of man? Look what they're doing. Is this a trivial thing? It was anything but trivial. That's why they were where they are to begin with. They were down in this captivity. And God said, they have returned to provoke me to anger. And then he makes a statement in the last part of verse 17. Indeed, they have put the branch to their nose. Now, who wants to tell me what that is? I'd like to know. It's probably a proverbial saying of some kind that has to do with scoffing with God. Therefore, God says, I'm not going to put up with this. Verse 18, I will act in fury. My eye will not pity. Though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. Remember back in 1 Kings 18 when the people cried out to their God in the days of Elijah, when they built this altar and so forth, and he wouldn't listen to them. Their God was deaf. And now then, Israel has a God that's deaf. He said, I will not listen to all of this. And so that's how bad they were. Anything on chapter 8 anyone would like to talk about? Yes, Joe?
Verbally sharing this with the elders.
Do what?
He's not verbally sharing this with the elders at this point. He's just seeing.
I'm sorry. Verbally what?
He's not verbally sharing these visions with the elders that are sitting with him. He's just.
I'm sorry. I didn't get that word after verbally.
Sharing.
I got verbally.
Sharing.
Oh, sharing. Sharing. Okay.
He's seeing these visions, but he's not telling the elders at this point.
Yeah, I think. Well, he said, this is what I see. This is what God is telling the prophet. Look at this. This is what these people are doing.
Then what is the prophet doing? Is he just hearing?
Well, I must be missing something. My hearing is not the best, but I think what we need to understand is that this is how far those people have gone from God, and this prophet is telling them that. He is not going to mince any words about it. This is what you've done. These are the consequences. And these elders that are with him, as you mentioned there, some have thought maybe there was a group of elders that, besides the one that went in with the captivity with him, but I don't think so. They probably went down with him to begin with. And so they've turned their backs on God as well. After services, Joe, we'll talk about it. I'll hear you a little bit better. Okay, anything else?
Seems to me that we're looking at that statement there in verse 17 is a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here. Just to make an application to us today, sometimes we do things that we shouldn't do, and we tend to think it might be a trivial thing.
Yeah.
But God looks at it as an abomination.
That's right.
We need to
Yeah. Yeah. It seem like a little thing to us, but God doesn't look at it that way. Yes, Clark.
A week or two ago, in class, they were talking about that his tongue was going to be tied for like 7 years. It was for 1 year for every day or whatever. And answer to Joe's question, is this not just God walking Ezekiel through all this? Ezekiel's not telling the story yet because it's only been 6 years and 6 months.
Well, God is showing your prophet these things, yes.
But the prophet's not sharing them yet. With
Not that I know of. I think he.
I think
Yeah.
that's what Joe was asking.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Probably not. Probably not. Okay.
You don't have to talk like that.
Hearing problems are a real advantage at home sometimes. They're a great disadvantage in a class. I'd be like the fellow he accused his wife of not listening to him, and he was sitting in his chair in the living room. She was in the kitchen. He said, "What's for supper?" No answer. He got up and he walked halfway in. He said, "What's for supper?" No answer. And he said, "I knew she needed hearing aids." Finally, he leaned over her shoulder and said, "What's for supper?" She said, "Fried chicken. I've told you 3 times. So, okay. Well, our time is rapidly getting away, and we're not going to have time to get into detail with chapter 9. But I want to bounce chapter 9 off of the last verse in chapter 8. Let's look at chapter 8 and verse 18. Therefore, that is because of all this ungodliness, therefore I will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. Therefore I will act in fury. God says, that's what I'm going to do. Now then, the best thing I can tell you in the few minutes we got left in chapter 19, in chapter 19 is how God's going to act, is how he's going to do that. You see these 6 or 7 men that, oh yes, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I don't want to, I know you're running for time.
That's
But
okay.
I think the point here really needs to be made strong. There's a time in which God's mercy and his patience gives out.
Absolutely.
And we better all realize that about God.
Absolutely.
And that's what we learn here. Right?
Yep. Happened to this nation.
Yes.
Okay, chapter 9, you have a group of 6 men. I don't know if there's 6 and then 1, or the 1 including the 6, but the 6 of them have destroying weapons in their hand. And these are God's servants that he's going to send into the city. Remember 8:18, I will send my fury. Chapter 9, how God's going to do it. And so you have these men with a weapon in their hand, these 6 men. And I've always thought it was odd that, not odd maybe, but when God decided to deal with somebody, he doesn't need anybody. But he only sent 1 to destroy the Egyptians, didn't he? That destroyer. Sometimes people call him a death angel. I don't know why he's called an angel. I don't think the Bible ever calls him that, but there wasn't but 1. In Genesis 18 or 19, he sent 2 angels to destroy Sodom. I don't know if that says anything how bad these people are or not, but here are 6 of them. And so they were God's instrument in destroying the city. And then there was another man that had an inkhorn. Might describe him as a scribe. If you look at verse 2, he had an inkhorn, and he was among them. And what that is about is simply saying, God is telling this man with the inkhorn in his hand, you go through the city of Jerusalem. There was a few faithful. God had his remnant. There was a few there that still had a reverence for God. And he says to this man with the inkhorn, you go through the city and you mark those who are faithful to me. There's still a few faithful to God. And when the destroyer comes through, those will be spared. And so that is the sum and substance of what's going on here when God, you see that in verse 4, go through the midst of the city and put a mark on their foreheads, and they would be spared when the judgment came. And so that was what they were supposed to do. Everyone was to be slain. If you look down in verse 6, it's a very broad brush they're being painted with there. And God would not put up with that. But he said, you begin with my people. Remind me of what Peter said, judgment must begin at the house of God. And so the chapter ends with the prophet interceding for the people. It's while they were destroying Jerusalem, he said, I fell on my face, said, Lord, would you destroy the remnant of Israel along with all the rest of them? And he points out that I will not spare. I will not show mercy. As Ronnie pointed out, the time for mercy is over. And so not having the time to deal with chapter 9, just remember that. You can say that chapter 9 is how God will bring his judgment that he has promised against this wicked city of Jerusalem. It was a bad situation. Verse 9 says it was full of bloodshed, perversity, and God, the Lord, they say the Lord has forsaken the land. He doesn't see. Well, that wasn't right. God did see. God knew. And because of that, he could show no mercy. And Ronnie's point is well taken. We need to understand there's a time when mercy will have exhausted itself. Well, I've enjoyed, as I told you last week, it had been several years since I'd taught the prophecy of Ezekiel. And I've enjoyed these last 2 weeks. Look forward to Sunday. Ben will be back and we'll take up the class at that time. Any questions or comments before we close? Shannon?
Do you think that was actually happening, what he was seeing, or that it was just figurative?
Well, that's what happened. If you, after the second deportation is recorded in the last chapter of Jeremiah, if you start with Jeremiah 52 and start with about verse 10, you can see all those things that took place. It was a very bad thing. It seemed like it was even worse than the destruction of Jerusalem. He told them that you've never seen anything like it, nor will you see it again. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate you all coming.